Have you ever walked into a room carrying all your belief, only to have it crushed by a single dismissive smile? Have you ever laid out an idea straight from your heart, only to be ignored? Judged not by your words, but by your skin, by the clothes you wear? Dismissed with, "No one's going to bet on you." That is the quiet pain so many Black people are forced to swallow. The pain not of a bad idea, but of an existence never seen as equal. A pain deeper than failure because it plants the cruelest question. Do I even deserve to sit at this table? But in the depths of humiliation, a higher fire can spark. Because the greatest triumph isn't to be accepted, is to turn rejection into power, to rebuild justice on your own terms. Imagine a Black woman who doesn't walk away forever, but whispers to herself, "If they shut the door, I'll buy the building. If they laugh, I'll make them bow." This is the story of Lydia Monroe. A year ago, she was rejected, betrayed, humiliated, but 1 year later, she returned. Not to beg for a seat, but to buy the very table where they once mocked her. A reversal so sharp, every doubter fell silent. If you've ever witnessed injustice like this, leave a like, share this story, and don't forget to subscribe with the bell on, because these are the stories you'll want to hear through to the end. Because this is not only Lydia Monroe's story, it's a reminder. Anyone who has ever been denied has the power to return, proud, unshaken, and in control of the entire game. And it all began on that day, in the investor's room where Lydia Monroe was first denied outright. Lydia Monroe stepped into the room, bathed in bright white light, the high ceiling reflecting the figures in spotless suits like an army of faceless soldiers. A Black woman, standing amid that sea of pale fabric, her eyes burned with conviction. Her hand tightened slightly around the folder as her heartbeat kept its steady rhythm. In a place where every glance weighed like a hammer, she carried with her the belief that an idea could shatter the wall between ambition and opportunity. The silence was cathedral-like, a shrine to power. The air carried the heavy blend of expensive cologne and polished leather chairs. The faint clicks of pens, the tap of shoes against hardwood floors, all reminders that Lydia was an outsider. No words were needed. The stairs alone whispered, "You don't belong here." But Lydia did not bow her head. She had prepared for this day for years. Long nights, meticulous research, messy sketches on her kitchen table, all distilled into this single plan. In that moment, she believed it would be reason and vision that prevailed, not skin color or accent. When she began to speak, her voice low, steady, clear, the first thing she heard wasn't attention. It was a muffled cough, followed by a stifled laugh at the far end of the table. A silver-haired man in a striped suit leaned toward his colleague and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Interesting. I suppose they're dabbling in startups now." The room broke into laughter, not the joyful kind, but the brittle, mocking kind. Lydia stopped, fixing her gaze on them. She said nothing. Her eyes did not flinch. And it was that very silence that made a few straighten in their seats, uneasy that they couldn't shatter her composure. But contempt thickened the air. A younger judge, his wrist weighed down by a gleaming watch as though to flaunt his worth, cut through her presentation. "Listen, the idea isn't bad. But realistically, no one is going to hand over money to a face like yours. We need representatives the market can trust, and I'm sorry. You are not that." The words dropped like a sentence. Lydia stood motionless. In that instant, she felt the centuries of prejudice pressing on her shoulders. Yet instead of breaking, the corner of her mouth curved into a thin smile. Bitter. Sharp. Because she knew one truth. If they thought slamming this door would end her, they were mistaken. Their laughter was the spark for a path none of them could foresee. But Lydia didn't yet know. The humiliation today was only the first cut. And the hand that would drive the knife deeper belonged to someone she once trusted. She inhaled, steadying her voice. She had barely presented her first figures when a hand sliced the air, silencing her. The man at the center table, his blood-red tie like a slash across the room, tapped his fingers against polished wood. "Enough," he said, not bothering to meet her eyes. "Do you know how many pipe dreams like this we've heard? We invest in faces that can persuade the market, not—" He paused, squinting for the right word, then shrugged. "Faces like this." Laughter rang out again, dry, metallic, like a steel door slamming shut. Some didn't even bother to hide it. The short, clipped bursts of laughter cut the air like small knives. Lydia felt each blade, but her eyes never left the folder in her hand. She tried again. "If you'll just give me 2 more minutes, I can show you—" "No need," another cut in, reclining in his chair, arms crossed. "Time is more valuable than whatever you've brought here. You should learn to respect that." A woman to the left tilted her head, diamond earrings flashing, adding her own dagger. "We're looking for leaders with a professional image. And forgive me, but a young black woman with no backing, no pedigree, doesn't inspire confidence. Your idea might be fine, but we invest in people, not dreams." Nods of agreement spread through the room, like a choir rehearsed long before she arrived. The room, so bright a moment ago, now seemed like a pit, swallowing what confidence she had left. She stood there, no shouting, no pleading. In her humiliation, she saw irony. They thought they were teaching her a lesson. In truth, they were exposing themselves. They weren't judging her plan, they were judging her skin. They weren't rejecting her idea, they were rejecting her image. Each laugh pounded her dream, built from sleepless nights and sweat. But instead of shattering, it hardened, like steel forged in fire. Every strike only made it stronger. Lydia pressed her lips, her eyes burning. In that moment, she said nothing, but her silence spoke louder than words. Her composure unsettled more than one pair of eyes in the room. Because her silence was not surrender, it was the beginning of a storm. A heavy door swung open behind her, signaling the end of her pitch. She was asked to leave like an uninvited guest stumbling into a feast. She walked out. The thick wooden door shut behind her with a thud, a sound like a final verdict. But in her heart, it echoed like the tolling of a beginning. What Lydia didn't know was that this humiliation was only the prelude. The sharpest betrayal was yet to come, and it would be delivered not by strangers but by someone she called an ally. The heavy door closed with a dry thud that lingered like a verdict. Inside, laughter still spilled through the cracks, a cruel refrain. Outside, Lydia stood still, breathing deep, letting the air flow through her without letting it crush her. She looked around. Whitewashed walls, neatly hung abstract art, golden light flaunting luxury. But all of it only sharpened one bitter truth. This world was built with doors meant to keep outsiders out, no matter what they carried in their hands. A group of other candidates passed by, their tailored suits immaculate. They glanced at Lydia, exchanged faint smirks, part pity, part ridicule. She felt it all, but she did not bow her head. Instead, her eyes lit with another fire. Not the glow of someone begging to be let in, but the spark of someone preparing to burn through walls. In her mind, every laugh, every insult echoed. Each word, instead of extinguishing her flame, poured fuel on it. They thought they had ended a dream, but for Lydia, that moment was the birth of a new resolve. She smiled. A thin smile, impossible to tell if bitter or proud. But it was a vow. This humiliation would not be forgotten. It would become her sharpest weapon. And when she returned, she wouldn't just sit at the table, she would silence the entire room. Her heels struck the hallway floor, each step echoing like the drumbeat of a different journey. She carried no victory, no comfort. What she carried was a sentence and a torch. They say when one door closes, another opens. But Lydia knew better. Sometimes no door opens at all. Sometimes you have to break the wall yourself. And she was ready to do just that. In her eyes, the spark flared. None of them inside knew they had just handed her the deadliest gift: humiliation. And nothing is more dangerous than a black woman who turns humiliation into fuel to own the game. But Lydia still couldn't foresee it. The deepest cut was yet to come. And it would come from the very person she once called her ally. After that heavy door shut behind her, Lydia returned to the small apartment where she and her co-founder had spent countless nights working. The room had no polished wooden tables, no crystal chandeliers, just an old dining table scarred with scratches and the smell of coffee soaked deep into the wood. But to Lydia, this was the place where ideas first began to breathe, where they came alive. She set the folder down, her heart heavy yet still holding onto an anchor. Because beneath all the scornful stares and cheap laughter, she still believed at least one person was on her side. That co-founder, the one who had stayed up through sleepless nights with her, arguing over every line of data, eating instant noodles to save money, was her last comfort. Lydia believed that when that door slammed shut, the two of them would find another way. She believed that bond was enough to outweigh the humiliation, because if anyone truly understood the value of their idea, it had to be the person who had written every line of code, adjusted every page of the plan with her. Sitting in the old chair, Lydia sighed softly. She told the story of the pitch, every word, every laugh. Her voice cracked on the bitter parts, but she still held on to a thread of hope. That together they could build a new plan, that from these ashes a different fire could rise. As Lydia spoke, her eyes sometimes drifted toward the photos hanging on the wall. Two young faces, exhausted yet glowing with happiness, raising a whiteboard filled with scribbles. Those photos were proof of a friendship, proof of shared belief. But even as Lydia leaned into that trust, the air in the room began to shift. A strange silence slipped between her words. Her co-founder didn't respond with outrage or sympathy, only silence, their eyes sliding away, as if calculating something else. Lydia didn't notice. She kept talking, speaking of new strategies, of not giving up. Her voice grew brighter, like a lamp just rekindled. She had no idea that in that silence a crack had already formed. And that crack wasn't carved by outsiders, it came from the very person she trusted most. Because sometimes the deepest cuts don't come from enemies. They come from the hand that once held yours in the beginning. And Lydia was about to learn that truth in the harshest way. Her faith began to falter one gloomy afternoon when she stumbled upon an online article. On the screen was the familiar image of the product she and her co-founder had sketched together in the early days. But the headline froze her. Promising young founding team secures deal with prestigious investment board. Founding team, but no mention of her. Lydia scrolled down, reading each line, scanning the list of names celebrated. Her co-founder's name appeared in bold, accompanied by praise for their vision, resilience, and exceptional leadership. Each word cut into her chest like a blade. At first, Lydia thought it had to be a printing error, some oversight. But when she opened the public records, the truth stared back, raw and undeniable. Every document had been revised, her name erased as if she had never existed. She recalled the sidelong glances, the long silences during their last conversation. They weren't signs of fatigue. They were signs of a decision already made. The person who once shared cheap meals and laughter had now signed a deal with the very people who had humiliated her and done it behind her back. A bitter irony crossed Lydia's mind. The most dangerous betrayal didn't come from cold investors, but from the one who had sat beside her all those years. And worse, they didn't need to stab her with a knife. They only needed a pen to erase her. The tiny apartment now felt suffocating. Lydia sat frozen before the screen, staring at photos of the signing ceremony. Bright smiles, firm handshakes, glasses of wine raised high. In those frames, there was no place for her. The world called it success. To Lydia, it was a cheap play staged on betrayal. She bit her lip until it bled, but no tears came. Tears would change nothing. Instead, she let the pain soak into her veins, turning into something else. Resolve. They could take away her name, but not her mind. They could erase her title, but not her endurance. Lydia understood a brutal truth. The sharpest knife isn't held by an enemy, but by the person you trust. And when that knife comes down, it forces you to choose. Collapse or rise and forge armor from the wound. She didn't yet know that this betrayal was only the beginning. Ahead lay more closed doors, more false smiles, and a system designed to crush her. But from this moment on, she would learn how to bend the game in ways no one could predict. Lydia sat motionless, eyes locked on the screen, on her co-founder's dazzling smile. It was like a blade twisting in her chest, slow, deliberate, reminding her she had been erased from the very ground she helped plant. She remembered those long nights, debating every number, every idea. She remembered the simple weekend meals when they clinked cheap coffee cups and promised that one day they would celebrate with expensive wine. That day had come, but the wine glasses in those photos weren't for her. Instead, every promise, every memory had been sold off with a single handshake. Worse, sold to the very people who once mocked her. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a cruel joke, one that pushed Lydia to the margins while others basked under the lights. Her chest tightened, but she didn't cry. She wouldn't allow it. Tears would only blur the reality she needed to see with perfect clarity, so she could carve it into her memory. And then something strange happened. In the middle of that piercing pain, her lips curved into a faint smile. It wasn't the smile of surrender, nor the mask to hide a wound. It was a bitter smile, cold and sharp, as if she had just witnessed a play so shallow it wasn't worth a single tear. Because Lydia understood one thing. People who climb quickly by stepping on others rarely realize the ground beneath them is hollow. And when time comes, that emptiness will swallow them whole. Her smile was a silent vow. She would not forget this day. She would not forget the hateful stares, the mocking laughter, or the handshake that betrayed her. All of it would become the fuel for the road she was about to carve, a road none of them could imagine. Lydia knew this betrayal was not the end. It was a death knell, ringing slowly for those who had rushed too eagerly to claim victory. They thought they had won, but in truth they had just written their own obituary. As for Lydia, she quietly stood, gathering the last shard of pride from the ashes. In her eyes, the faint spark was turning into a flame, and once that flame grew, no one would ever put it out. This betrayal was only the beginning. Ahead were higher walls and tighter doors, but when the time came, Lydia wouldn't just walk through, she would tear them all down. That morning, Lydia stepped into a towering glass building, every surface polished until it reflected the very hope in her eyes. This was no longer the investor's room filled with mocking laughter. This was a luxury bank, decorated as though power itself could be placed on display. The ceilings rose like cathedrals, crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the reception desk stretched like a giant mirror reflecting each customer's steps. In her hand, Lydia carried nothing more than a slim briefcase, but in her heart she carried something heavier, a new faith. Despite betrayal, despite being erased from her own creation, she still believed there were other paths forward. A loan, a line of credit, could be the key to starting again. She took a seat in the waiting area, her eyes sweeping the room. Men in tailored gray suits, women with designer handbags. Each was greeted with warm smiles, gentle bows, and their names spoken as if by family. Everything in this place was designed to inspire trust. When her turn came, Lydia rose and walked to the consultation desk. The banker, a middle-aged man with a well-rehearsed smile, gestured for her to sit. "Miss Monroe," he said softly, polite enough to ease her nerves. She opened the briefcase and laid out her plan. Figures, projections, every detail mapped out. She spoke of markets, of growth, of how one loan could relight a project's flame. Her voice steady, her words crisp. This time, she believed, logic would matter more than prejudice. The banker nodded as he flipped through the pages, eyes fixed in what looked like genuine focus. He scribbled notes, offered small smiles, smiles that made Lydia believe she was finally being heard. No derisive laughter, no disdainful stares. Only civility. But behind that civility hid something else. Something colder. Something far more dangerous than the open cruelty of the pitch room. For cruelty at least revealed the truth. Civility, Lydia was about to learn, could hide a blade sharper than any insult. Minutes later, she would understand. Banks didn't need to humiliate a black woman outright. They only needed courtesy polished enough to usher her out the door and still make her say thank you. The banker continued flipping through her file, smiling like his face had been carved that way. He even praised her. "You've prepared this extremely well. Honestly, your plan is more structured than many others we've seen." Lydia's heart stirred. For the first time, someone seemed to recognize her effort without rushing to dismiss her. She straightened, her eyes bright, waiting for the verdict. And then, his smile shifted. It hardened, thin as a blade wrapped in velvet. He closed the file, folded his hands, and said, calm as ice, "However, after reviewing your proposal and assessing capacity, I'm afraid your application does not meet our standards for approval." The words fell like cold water, extinguishing the flame that had just flickered. Not mocking laughter this time, something worse. A sterile courtesy that made rejection feel like ritual. Like being handed a warm cup of tea only to be told you'd never be welcome at the table. Lydia pressed her lips together. "Could you explain, is there something I can adjust to meet the standards?" The man's smile remained fixed, but his eyes flicked to his watch, as if Lydia's time was an inconvenience. "It's not about the numbers," he replied. "It's about market confidence. We need faces investors are willing to follow. I'm sure you understand." She had heard these words before. In that pitch room, from men who sneered at her. And now they returned, dressed up as policy. As Lydia sat there in silence, irony unfolded behind her. At the next desk, a group of young founders arrived, laughing in designer suits. Lydia recognized them instantly, the copycats, the very ones who had stolen her idea. And while her application was not up to standard, theirs was being met with firm handshakes and promises of immediate disbursement. The world turned like a cruel stage play. The same idea, the same plan, yet the only difference lay in the face, the skin, of the one holding the file. Lydia smiled faintly, no longer in hope, but in record. She was memorizing each detail, each glance, each word, because she knew. One day, those rushed handshakes would become the very rope that choked the men, now basking in borrowed power. She rose, nodded politely, and whispered her thanks, a final gesture of etiquette. But in her eyes, the ember had already caught fire. They believed civility could erase her, that with one polite smile they could edge a black woman out of the game without leaving a trace. But they had shown her something else. Every mask has a crack, and cracks are where power leaks through. In that moment, Lydia understood. This rejection did not close the road. It opened a new war, one where she would no longer knock on doors. She would learn how to buy the entire building. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she walked out. Around her, the bank thrummed on, printers humming, glasses clinking, laughter bubbling at the neighboring desk where the winners were promised their golden loans. Smooth, seamless, as if nothing unjust had occurred. But Lydia had seen enough. The banker's polished smile had revealed something uglier than cruelty, the way politeness itself could be used as a weapon. No shouting, no open insult, just the phrase, "not up to standard," spoken like the turning of a lock. And bitterest of all, behind her, the bank was swinging its doors wide for the copycats. Soft leather chairs, chilled water, promises of fast funding. The very idea she had built, suddenly valuable when presented by different faces. Lydia closed her eyes. In the darkness, an image sharpened, a perfumed hand offering a porcelain teacup, sweet words in the air, while beneath the table a blade gleamed, waiting for the smallest slip. Here, they didn't need to scream, "You don't belong." They only needed to smile and you'd walk out quietly, grateful for being heard. That was the true law of the game. Keep the door closed while making the excluded thank you for the courtesy. Lydia drew in a breath and opened her eyes. She no longer expected fairness in these gleaming rooms. Instead, she had begun to study the game. And once you learn the rules, you can learn to bend them, or break the board entirely. That day, Lydia realized, the rules were never written for her to win. But once she could read them, she could write them anew. News traveled faster than the wind. Within a single night, the name Lydia Monroe spread across financial news outlets, not as a beacon of innovation, but as a living example of a downfall. Headlines blared in unison. Black female founder knocked out of the game. The inevitable failure of a fool's dream. Social media became a grand stage for cheap laughter. Photos of Lydia standing before the investment board, eyes steady but alone, were cut, edited, and turned into memes. Mocking captions flooded timelines from people who had never met her. Tried to play in the big leagues, and the result was followed by laughing emojis. No one cared about the truth behind it all. No one asked about the idea she carried. They only wanted a single image. A black woman leaving a polished boardroom, clutching her folder, caught by the flash of cameras as proof of failure. Lydia read those articles in a darkened room. The window cracked open, daylight spilling across the wall as if to remind her the world kept moving. Only she had been cast aside. Every sentence, every comment, was like a stone tossed into a pond, sending ripples through her mind. Yet within that silence, she felt a storm building inside. The bitterest part was this. While they mocked her, the copycat startup was being celebrated on the very same pages. The men who had laughed during her pitch were now praised as courageous pioneers. The world seemed intent on swapping roles. Thieves were crowned as innovators, while the true originator was reduced to a punchline. But Lydia did not collapse. On the contrary, she began to see the naked truth of the game. The public wasn't seeking fairness. They craved easy stories, digestible images. And her image, a black woman walking away in silence, was too convenient a symbol of failure to resist. A flash of irony crossed her mind. Society loved to talk about diversity, to cheer for startups, to applaud fresh ideas. But in reality, they only loved stories that drew clicks, that fed cheap laughter. Lydia closed her laptop. The room was pitch dark, but in that darkness she smiled faintly. Not the smile of surrender, but of someone who had just learned an expensive lesson. The mockery of the crowd doesn't define worth. It only exposes their laziness. What Lydia didn't yet know was that this mockery would soon become fire. A crucible that would force her to reshape herself. From that very ridicule, she would learn how to turn cheap laughter into a weapon. Her name began showing up in business classes, not as a story of resilience, but as a case study in failure. Professors dissected why the young woman couldn't persuade investors, while students scribbled notes as if examining a failed experiment. On the projector slides, her face sat beside charts bleeding red, like a warning label. Do not take this path. Meanwhile, the press showered praise on the copycat founders. Articles overflowed with glowing words, groundbreaking innovation, an idea destined to transform the industry. Photos of them in tailored suits, standing at podiums, graced magazine covers. And there Lydia was, alone in her small apartment, reading line after line, none of which mentioned she had planted the seed of the very idea now being worshipped. The contrast cut like a knife. The true originator erased, the imitators turned into legends, and the crowd, gleeful, repeated the script handed to them, that Lydia Monroe was proof of blindness, of startup delusion, too naive to understand the rules. More painful still, those comments wore the cloak of objectivity. A TV pundit declared, "The Monroe case proves that ambition alone isn't enough. To succeed, you need context, networks, and the right image. She lacked all three." Audiences nodded, convinced they had just learned a new truth. Lydia absorbed it all, not to torment herself, but to carve the lesson deep. Every time her name was used as shorthand for failure, she felt a new layer of strength take root. She knew they weren't analyzing truth. They were sanitizing prejudice with professional language. And she realized something brutally ironic. People could chant diversity, hang banners about opportunity for every idea. But when it came time to choose, they always picked the face that matched the trust they already knew. What they called the market was nothing more than a mirror reflecting old bias. Sitting in the dark, Lydia chuckled. A short, sharp laugh. Not from joy, but to mark the absurdity of it all. If society was so eager to label her a case study in failure, then one day they would have to relearn that very lesson from a book she herself would write. What she couldn't see yet was that the glossy myth being built around her rivals was already cracking. The celebration would not last forever. In the weeks that followed, Lydia's story continued to circle in the media and on social feeds. People invoked her name to sneer, to make points, to fuel startup lessons. They laughed as though watching a cheap comedy with Lydia cast as the clown. In a business class, students projected her face on a big screen and burst into laughter as the professor pointed and said, "This is the textbook example of overconfidence and poor preparation." In coffee shops, her name was dropped with disdain, then quickly forgotten, like an outdated song. Yet while the crowd was noisy, another truth was unfolding quietly. The investors who had once praised the copycat team began noticing their numbers didn't match reality. Financial reports grew messy, debts ballooned in silence. Behind the flashbulbs and glowing articles were late-night emergency meetings scrambling to patch leaks. The very men being celebrated were the ones struggling in the shadows. They lacked the skill to run an idea they had merely stolen. Rash decisions, reckless spending, the cracks ate away at the legend the press had built. But the outside world remained unaware, the glossy facade still thick enough to hide the rot. Meanwhile, Lydia sat in her small apartment, quietly watching. Others saw failure, she saw opportunity. The crowd mocked her, but their laughter allowed her to vanish from scrutiny, to rebuild without being watched. They thought they'd written her out of the game, but the real game was only beginning. A flicker of irony touched her lips. Yes, they called her a failure. But if this failure was the price she paid to learn the true rules of the game, then it was cheap. Far cheaper than the mounting debts strangling the so-called winners. In the shadows, Lydia studied, calculated, hunted for loopholes in the system. She read finance books, attended small workshops, tracked the missteps of others. Each day she grew harder, sharper, turning humiliation into strategy, pain into fuel. The crowd laughed loud and long, but they had no idea the story they told was only a temporary chapter. Lydia wasn't gone. She was preparing. And when the time came, their laughter would give way to a silence heavy as stone, the silence of those who suddenly realized they had lost a game they never saw coming. While the public still buzzed and the mocking headlines hadn't yet cooled, Lydia suddenly vanished from the stage of attention. No more photographs of her in boardrooms, no rebuttals, no statements, no defense. As if she had been beaten completely, bowed her head and walked away from the game. People were quick to conclude, she quit. Financial experts smiled smugly, treating Lydia's silence as undeniable proof that they were right. Around the investors' roundtables, her name was no longer spoken. And to the crowd, Lydia Monroe became nothing more than a faint smudge in memory, a joke that had ended. But the truth was very different. Lydia hadn't disappeared. She had simply stepped back from the spotlight. Instead of standing beneath the glare of prying eyes, she returned to the shadows, a place where no one paid attention, a place where she could observe and learn without the pressure to prove herself immediately. In that darkness, Lydia began collecting every shard of experience and pain. She read relentlessly, from dry financial textbooks to the memoirs of entrepreneurs who had been buried and then resurrected. She attended small, unglamorous workshops where there were no cameras, only people rich in lived experience. And more importantly, Lydia learned how to listen. To the stories of other entrepreneurs who had been kicked out of negotiation rooms, to whispers about deals that collapsed, about boards that looked invincible but were full of cracks inside. Every word, every fragment of information became a chess piece she quietly tucked away for herself. The irony was sharp. While the crowd believed Lydia had given up, she was actually drawing closer to the real game. They thought she had lost, but in truth, she was learning to play again. This time with a rule book she was writing herself. In the mornings, Lydia sat at a quiet cafe, typing in silence, building spreadsheets of analysis. In the evenings, she slipped into overlooked offices, buying tiny shares from companies on the edge of liquidation. No one noticed, but each piece she gathered was building toward a new financial network. Quiet, sturdy, hidden in plain sight. In silence, Lydia was amassing her army. Not an army of applause or fireworks, but one of information, of equity, of backroom alliances. And while they still laughed, Lydia understood a truth. Stage lights only blind people. Real power is always built in the dark. The crowd thought Lydia had disappeared. They had no idea that this disappearance was the beginning of a return that would shake the financial world to its core. When the world believed Lydia was gone, she was simply changing her seat at the table. No longer standing in the glare, she went undercover, entering the game through doors the arrogant never bothered to notice. She started with the smallest of investments, too humble for anyone to care about. An overlooked stake in a dying startup. A fragment of funding in a project big investors called too risky. Like a patient farmer planting seeds in the night, Lydia gathered these scraps, waiting for the harvest. But Lydia wasn't just buying shares, she was decoding the game. She slipped into closed-door seminars, sitting quietly in the back rows, absorbing every lecture on how to control markets. Each word, each case study, each number projected on the screen was etched into her mind, not to admire, but to dismantle. The irony was rich. While the so-called titans used these events to flaunt their brilliance, Lydia turned them into free classrooms. None of them realized that, in the shadows, a black woman was gathering the scraps of knowledge they threw away, piecing together a complete picture of her own. She also began building a hidden network, not the flashy relationships immortalized in magazine spreads, but backroom conversations, handshakes over diner tables, contracts scribbled on napkins. Those discarded by the system, small entrepreneurs, overlooked engineers, managers pushed out of chairs, slowly became her allies. She listened to their stories, shared her own failures, and from that, wove a network bound by lived scars, not fake polish. Quietly, she built an invisible army strong enough to tilt the board when the time was right. Lydia knew real strength wasn't in loud laughter, but in agreements whispered behind closed doors. And if she wanted to flip the board, she would need to accumulate every piece one by one until the day came to strike. Night after night, Lydia labored in her small room, the glow of her screen reflecting in fierce eyes. She was no longer the failure case study the crowd had mocked. She was becoming a new kind of player, one who understood the rules and was ready to break them if needed. The crowd still thought she had surrendered. In reality, Lydia had stepped into her next role, architect of an empire in the shadows. And when the sun finally rose, no one would understand how the board had suddenly shifted entirely into her hands. Out in the world, time passed as if Lydia had disappeared. No articles mentioned her name, no whispers in conferences, no one asked where she was. To the world, Lydia Monroe was just another loser briefly remembered, then forgotten, like a smudged line of ink on a page. But in the dark, the story was very different. Lydia worked tirelessly, patient as a spider spinning her web. Each conversation, each scrap of data, each tiny share she bought became another thread. The first strands were thin, fragile. But layer upon layer, cross upon cross, the web grew vast, invisible, and unbreakable. She knew in finance, power didn't come from flashing lights or flattering headlines. It came from underground alliances, from dry numbers buried in paperwork, from clauses in contracts no one bothered to read. And that was exactly where Lydia laid her traps. Her silence became her shield. No one saw her as a threat anymore. Those who mocked her thought the game was finished. They didn't know she was circling them, patiently tightening the net. Sometimes Lydia laughed, a sharp, ironic laugh. How strange that humiliation had turned into the perfect cloak of invisibility. The more they dismissed her, the freer she became to act. The more distracted they were by their own spotlight, the more quietly she spun her web. Day by day, her net thickened. Abandoned shareholders sought her out. Mid-level employees disillusioned with their bosses leaked information. Young founders tired of a rigged system began to trust Lydia. Piece by piece, thread by thread, the net took shape. The world thought Lydia had collapsed. But in truth, she was creating something far more dangerous than any headline could imagine. A massive, quiet, almost invisible web stretched wide. And when the time came, it wouldn't roar or flash. It would only tighten, fast, silent, leaving no room to breathe. The web was ready, and the ones now basking in applause had no idea they were already her first prey. A year had passed since Lydia stepped away from the spotlight, and the world believed her story was over. But while her name faded into silence, those who once sat at the highest tables began to falter. The prestigious investment council, the very same group that once laughed in Lydia's face, no longer carried its air of dominance. Behind closed boardroom doors, there was no applause, no sparkling wine, only shouting matches that echoed off the walls. Members sat around a long wooden table, voices sharp, fingers jabbing at one another, arguing over numbers that no longer hid the truth. The startup copy, their proud trophy once hailed as the future of the industry, was drowning in debt. Reckless spending, costly yet useless PR campaigns, and the incompetence of hand-picked founders had turned that promise into a gaping deficit. A financial newspaper softly reported the company needed restructuring, but in reality, restructuring was just a polite word for collapse. They were bleeding money daily, and the investors knew it, just not enough to say it out loud. The atmosphere in the boardroom was thick with fear. One member slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "We've sunk too much money to pull out now." Another snapped back, and throwing more in is no different than tossing it out the window. Chairs screeched, sighs echoed. It was a discordant symphony marking the beginning of the end. The irony was sharp. A year ago, these were the very people who declared Lydia unfit, insisting the market needed convincing faces. Yet those polished, magazine-ready faces were now the reason the entire system was unraveling. Still, they refused to admit their mistake. They staged press conferences, delivering confident speeches in crisp white suits, glasses of red wine in hand, speaking of a bright future. Cameras flashed outside, while inside, red numbers blazed across their financial screens. Some whispered about retreat, selling off shares to escape. But the more they pulled out, the more obvious their crumbling foundation became. The grand fortress of a year ago was now nothing more than a cracked wall, moments away from collapse. And in the midst of this chaos, no one remembered Lydia Monroe. They thought she had vanished, a relic of a failed story. That very forgetting would prove their fatal mistake. Because while they were busy arguing and patching their sinking ship, Lydia was ready to step out of the shadows, with a move none of them could have predicted. On the front pages, the council still looked untouchable. Cold faces, tailored suits, confident statements before the cameras. They spoke of long-term vision, assuring that challenges are temporary. To the public, they appeared steady, even arrogant, like monuments impossible to topple. But that was only the paint on the surface. Inside, the truth was rot. In private meetings, polished speeches gave way to shouting matches. Reports were slammed onto tables, members hurled accusations like daggers. Some demanded pouring more money into the failing startup copy. Others fought to cut ties, desperate to salvage personal reputations. Decisions weren't guided by strategy, but by fear. Fear of being branded failures. Late-night calls became routine. Phones buzzed nonstop. Inboxes overflowed, all circling one question: how to keep up the facade when the foundation was crumbling beneath them. Yet the harder they tried to hide it, the more the chaos spilled through the cracks. In one heated meeting, a council member banged his hand against the table and roared, "If this company collapses, so does our reputation. Do you want your name in the press as a failure?" Another sneered back, "Reputation's already gone. You're just too proud to admit it. Don't drag us all down with you. The room descended into bedlam. Chairs scraped, voices overlapped, no one listening to anyone else. It was no longer a meeting but a stage play of arguments, each actor terrified of the curtain falling and revealing the ugly truth. And once again, the irony cut deep. Just a year earlier, they had dismissed Lydia as unqualified. They had raised their glasses of wine, declaring the market needed reliable faces. Now those very faces quivered in the dark, terrified of exposure. The arrogance on the outside and the decay within created a paradox too glaring to ignore. Yet society, as always, adored the performance. People loved their monuments, no matter how hollow. So the press still praised them, the public still clapped, and the council still strutted across stages with the same pride. But behind each performance, they returned to secret rooms where the shouting was louder than any applause. Meanwhile, Lydia watched in silence. She knew a castle built on sand could not stand. One strong wind, and it would all collapse, exposing the hollow foundation beneath. That wind was coming, and Lydia was the one preparing to blow it down. A year after being humiliated, Lydia was ready to step out of the shadows, not to beg for a seat, but to take the entire table for herself. A dazzling morning bathed the city's most luxurious hotel lobby in golden light, transformed into a stage for the powerful. The investment council, drowning in debt and internal feuds, now donned crisp new suits and stood tall before a sea of cameras. Outside the velvet ropes, the press room was packed, flashes exploding like fireworks, masking the cracks in their empire beneath the blinding glow. On the podium, a council member lifted his chin, voice steady and commanding. "We are proud to announce the company's upcoming IPO, a new chapter filled with promise." Applause erupted. That single line, nothing more than a veil, was enough to make the crowd believe. They spoke of the future, of breakthroughs, of growth. Not one dared whisper of the debts hanging over them like a storm cloud. Even their delivery was rehearsed to perfection, slow, confident, assured, all to convince the world that this castle of power still stood firm. A reporter raised his hand. "There are rumors the company is facing financial trouble. How do you respond?" One of the heavyweights chuckled, sipped his water, then replied smoothly, "In business, challenges are normal. What matters is turning challenges into opportunity." His answer glided out like a passage from a textbook. More applause followed. Cameras swept across the room, capturing smug smiles and firm handshakes. To the public eye, it looked flawless. But the irony was this. They could hide their collapse from the media, but not from themselves. Every word, every grin was strained. They knew the numbers didn't lie, and it would take just one shock to expose the rot beneath their polished walls. In the very back row, Lydia Monroe sat quietly. No one noticed her, and no one cared. To them, she was a relic, a name long erased. She watched in silence, not as an outsider, but as someone waiting for the curtain to rise. To Lydia, this wasn't a press conference. It was the prologue to her takeover. They had set the stage. They had summoned the crowd. They had painted a moment that seemed to belong to them. And in that exact moment, Lydia knew. Her time had come. 1 year ago, she walked out of a pitch room under a chorus of mocking laughter. Today, she returned in silence. But this silence was powerful enough to halt the entire room. Because in just a few minutes, those drunk on the illusion of their IPO would realize the very curtain they raised would be the one Lydia tore down before the world. As the press conference reached its peak, a figure rose from the back. Cameras swiveled and gasps rippled across the hall. It was a familiar face, the face once dismissed as failure. Lydia Monroe. A year ago, she had been pushed out, clutching a crumpled portfolio like an unwanted guest. Now she stood in a sleek black dress, sharp and composed, her calm gaze silencing the room. Reporters buzzed, lenses clicking furiously. Council members moments earlier grinning with arrogance froze, their faces hardening like stone. Lydia walked toward the podium. She didn't need a microphone. The hush in the hall was thick enough for every word to cut through. Her voice was low, measured, Less a declaration, more a story. You speak of IPOs and bright futures. Yet there's a truth no one here has mentioned. The company you promised the world is already rotting from within. And I know this better than anyone, because... She paused, locking eyes with the cameras. I now hold the majority stake in this very council. The room froze. A few whispers sparked, then vanished. The council members in the front row looked at one another, pale and stricken. A reporter nearly dropped his pen. Lydia went on, her words heavy, deliberate. A year ago, I was cast aside. They said I wasn't qualified. They thought erasing my name meant erasing my worth. But in the shadows, I learned how to play this game. I bought every piece you discarded, every share you underestimated. And today, I am not outside the door anymore. I hold the keys. The irony was unmistakable. 1 year ago, they toasted their absolute power. Now that power belonged to the woman they once mocked. It was as if the true director of the play had finally stepped on stage, shredding the script in front of them. The flashes burst again, this time not for the council, but for Lydia. The once arrogant faces sat frozen, speechless. No script had prepared them for this moment. Lydia wasn't finished. Declaring ownership was only the opening act. What she was about to do next would leave the entire hall in stunned silence. As her words sank in, a councilman known for his booming speeches tried to salvage the moment. He forced a smile, lifted his glass of red wine hoping to steady the air, but his hand trembled. The glass slipped. A crash? The shattering echoed through the hall. Red liquid spread across the marble floor like spilled pride. The room went dead silent. Applause died. Whispers vanished. For the first time, people looked at Lydia, truly looked at her. Not as the name mocked in old articles, not as a failed case study, but as a woman standing tall, unshaken, whose silence itself had become power. Her gaze swept the room, not vengeful, not screaming, but sharp, unyielding. She spoke slowly, every word carving into the air. You once told me I wasn't enough. You thought I'd always stand outside the door, but today it's I who decide who stays and who leaves. The silence that followed was crushing. Faces that once sneered now lowered, avoiding her eyes. Some reporters stopped writing altogether, simply staring, knowing history was unfolding before them. The irony was complete. A year ago, they laughed as they raised their glasses over her downfall. Now, a shattered glass on the marble floor marked their own. Lydia needed no shouting, no grand gestures. Her power lay in her calm, anchored in one simple truth delivered aloud, a truth strong enough to make them bow. The flashes still lit up the room, but no one looked at the council anymore. Every lens, every eye, every heartbeat was locked on Lydia Monroe. Because everyone knew this was only the beginning. The real question now hanging heavy in the silence was this. With her newfound power, what would Lydia Monroe do next? The chair once reserved for the chairman of the board sat at the center of the long table. Over the past year, countless faces had rotated through it, cloaking themselves in the illusion of power. But now the room was dead silent, every eye fixed on Lydia Monroe as she walked toward that chair. She did not rush. Her steps were measured, yet each one echoed against the wooden floor like a reminder of the long journey of someone once cast out from this very door. When she finally sat, the entire room seemed to shift in color. Those who had once stood above her shrank back, too afraid to even breathe too loudly. Lydia leaned into the chair, resting her hands lightly on the armrests. A simple motion, yet heavier than 1,000 speeches. In that moment, the chair no longer symbolized the board's authority. It became a monument to a complete reversal of power. On the table lay stacks of files, reports, glossy IPO plans. A year ago, her proposal had been ripped apart and tossed into the trash as worthless. Now, those same papers in front of her stood as proof of the board's rot, and as weapons Lydia could wield at any moment. Her eyes swept around the table. Familiar faces, once sneering, once mocking, now bowed their heads, avoiding her gaze. One man opened his mouth to speak, but Lydia tilted her head ever so slightly, and that small gesture alone silenced him. Any sound in this room could turn against its speaker. In this moment, Lydia had no need for anger. Her calm was the sharpest blade. What could be more devastating than seeing the woman they once declared not good enough, now sitting in the very seat they had fought so ruthlessly to protect? The room now belonged to Lydia, but she had not come merely to claim a chair. She came to remake the table itself. This table had once decided who was allowed to exist and who was cast out. It had been the stage for farce, deceit, and handshakes with knives hidden behind backs. And now, under Lydia's hands, it would become something else. Seated at the highest point, Lydia remained silent for a long moment. It wasn't silence for intimidation. It was silence that forced everyone present to absorb the truth. The rules had changed, and the author of those rules now sat before them. When she finally spoke, the entire room held its breath. Everyone knew. She hadn't just taken the biggest chair. She was about to lay the foundation for an entirely new table. Her voice was steady, deliberate. This table will now have seats for those who were once denied, like me. The room froze. Not because of a sharp insult, but because of disbelief. They had braced for vengeance, for ridicule equal to what they had once inflicted on her. Instead, Lydia flipped the game entirely. She turned toward the rows of reporters, eyes locking onto the cameras. The founders you cast aside because they didn't fit the mold, didn't carry the right name, didn't wear the right skin, they will have a place at this table. From now on, this is no longer a place of control. It will be a place of open doors. A smirk crept across a few board members' faces. They thought her naive, playing a cheap moral theater. But their smiles faltered as Lydia laid a folder on the table. Inside was a list of small companies, promising startups she had quietly funded during her absence. While you patched your debts, I was investing in the very people you rejected. And now they're not outside the door anymore. They walk in with me. Her words fell like a hammer. No applause, no chatter. Just silence, laced with panic. Because everyone understood, Lydia did not need loud revenge. She was rewriting the rules, turning mercy itself into her sharpest counterattack. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed, not on the board, but on Lydia. The arrogance in the board's eyes dissolved into unease. They understood she had altered the landscape, not just for herself, but for every person they had deemed unworthy. And that was the true threat. Still, one question lingered. Was Lydia opening this table for justice? Or was this a calculated move before delivering her final strike? The room drowned in a peculiar silence. Not the suffocating silence of contempt, nor the awkward void after mocking laughter. This was the heavy silence of power, a silence that forced once mighty men to lower their gaze. Lydia Monroe sat unmoving, like a black stone statue. No shouting, no pounding fists. Her mere presence made every chair around her feel suddenly too small. A year ago, they had thrown her out with mocking laughter. Now, none dared exhale too loudly. It was a portrait of paradox. A black woman once ridiculed now commanded the room with her calm. What was thought to be her final defeat had instead sharpened her resolve, and now the blade was no longer in their hands. It was in hers. She needed no self-congratulation, no grand speeches. The truth was simple and undeniable. Failure had not destroyed Lydia. It had remade her into a force no one could have predicted. At the far end of the table, an old man trembled, his pen clattering against the wood with a dry snap. The room flinched as though the sound had sealed a new era. And in this era, Lydia was no longer the outcast. She was the master of the game. Cameras clicked rapidly, but no photo could capture the weight of the silence pressing down on that room. A few board members shifted, thinking to stand and salvage dignity. Then they realized, standing meant leaving the table. Staying meant submitting to her rules. Either way, their old power was gone. Old power. Lydia slowly closed the folder as if closing an entire chapter of humiliation, betrayal, and scorn. When she lifted her gaze, it was no longer on the men around her, but on the future, where those once shut out would finally have a rightful seat. The door that had slammed behind her no longer locked anyone out. She hadn't just opened it, she had anchored herself in the seat that kept it open for all who came after. And in the air lingered one final, unspoken question, sharp as a warning. Who will dare underestimate a black woman again? If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.